Magnus Carlsen is the best player in the world right now, but that wasn't always the case. He had to climb his way up as a child, and once he was about 13, he started to get some chances against the very best. Let's take a look at a game against the previous world champion, Gary Kasparov. It's an interesting game. Gary showed up late. You can see here he was looking a bit stressed throughout it, and we'll see if Magnus was able to take him down. So Magnus has the white pieces here, and he starts out with d4, looking maybe for a more positional game. Black responds with d5, and we get the Queen's Gambit. Gary responds with c6, which is called the Slav setup, and this is super solid. It's what I used to play as a beginner, so if you're struggling against d4, I definitely recommend this. It's pretty easy to play. So both players are just going to develop their pieces normally here. You see the knights coming out, a few more pawn pushes. This isn't a bit of an aggressive bishop move by Magnus, already pinning the knight to the queen, but there's no problems yet for black just yet. Black just continues to develop, so does Magnus. And here comes the interesting stage of the opening. Black swings their queen out to a5. Now, this can be testing for players who aren't sure what they're doing, because basically, black can put a lot of pressure on this knight quite quickly if white's not careful. So, the reason this is especially difficult is this dark square bishop actually can't retreat to maybe get behind the knight and cause problems for the queen. And black can pressure this knight in a few ways. The bishop can come out and this knight can jump forward. So if you're not careful about that, the pressure can get a bit overwhelming. And that's why we see Magnus drop his knight back. It looks a bit strange, but when you know the plans, he's basically stopping this knight from jumping forward and also unpinning this knight as well. So very useful move in this situation. But Gary doesn't slow down. He brings the bishop out. Magnus just continues to calmly defend his piece here, brings the queen forward to defend, and now we get black. He's kind of given up on that initiative. Obviously, Magnus, who is an IM at this point, he's not going to fall for that, but a lot of people at the lower ratings will and maybe lose a pawn, or even worse, with this pressure coming from black. So now that Magnus has survived this pressure on his knight, he's just going to start developing normally again. Here comes the bishop. Here comes Gary, though. He's going to start opening up the center, moving his e-pawn for a second time, and it makes sense. His king is nice and safe on the side here, whereas Magnus is in the center. It could be in a bit of trouble. So it makes a lot of sense. Magnus decides he needs to get his king out of the way as well. Castle's kingside. We get some trades in the center, although Magnus gets a bit fancy here, moves his knight first. Gary repositions his queen. We get the recaptures, more captures in the center. But now the problem is Magnus is defending this knight, the pawn with his knight. The queen is exerting a bit of annoying pressure, and Gary wants to capitalize on this and plays a5. The threat is if he plays a4, this knight has to move and he gives up the pawn. So what Magnus does is he just blocks that progress, plays a4 himself. Gary decides to get his queen on a more aggressive diagonal, potentially eyeing up this h2 pawn. And Magnus makes a bit of a strange move here. He goes rook a to e1. So it's a bit strange because he's walking into a pin. Let's go back. He's walking into a pin. This bishop is still eyeing up that knight. And also, it would make some sense, I think, that maybe the rook would belong behind this pawn, but can't really argue with Magnus too much, obviously. Gary's not too interested in the pin. You'll see first he pushes the bishop away and then repositions his own bishop to eye up that h2 square and to try and cause some problems for Magnus on his kingside. So Magnus responds to the threat by pushing his h-pawn, getting out of the way of this battery with the queen and the bishop. And the next few moves are just crazy. I mean, there's just such a large sequence of just tactical kind of maneuvers. And these guys are professionals. I mean, I trust them, but it's tough to play like this. So it starts off by Gary moving his knight away. And this knight was a defender of the knight here on the king side. So Magnus decides to just immediately take him up on the offer there and tries to get Gary to ruin his pawn structure. But again, the tactics kind of work out here. Gary then decides to take this bishop, which was hanging. And again, it's like both players, they just don't give up on trying to out-tactic the other player. Magnus could just move his bishop out and be happy, but no. Magnus moves his knight, exposing an attack here on the knight here. Really wants Gary to take with the pawn, so Gary's obviously not going to do that. Instead, again, not moving his knight straight away, throwing in a check with the bishop, which is still all fine, by the way, still equal from both sides. Magnus moves his king away, but here comes a blunder from Gary, and it looks so normal. He just moves his knight back, and I think the reason why Gary didn't see this is because Magnus's move is ridiculous, but as a 13-year-old, he had nerves of steel. he decides to take the bishop. This knight blocked the connection with the bishop, but it just looks like a crazy move for Magnus to even think about taking here. I mean, walking in to this discovery with the queen, his bishop is still hanging. I mean, it's just looking ridiculous, but the engine eval is +2. Magnus, only 13 years old, is in the driver's seat right now. So it's a bit hard to understand why this is a +2 position. We'll just have to watch the game. It makes more sense as the moves play out. First, Gary takes the knight with check, winning back material equality, and it looks like they're about to win the bishop as well because that's still hanging, but Magnus has the important move, dropping his bishop back, supported by the pawn, and counterattacking the queen. There's a bit of a problem here. Black has to retreat with the knight because the knight was hanging as well. Again, crazy tactical position, but now there's this pin, and Magnus immediately starts to exploit it. First, he brings his queen up. Gary has to respond, blocking or adding another defender with the rook. And then Magnus plays d5, exploiting another pin. This queen is undefended, so the pawn can't take. So first, Black just moves out of the way of that pin. But here comes the knight. Black now can move this knight because the pin is no longer there. So he does, but Magnus ends up winning a pawn here. This knight was indirectly or directly attacking the c6 pawn. So we get a trade. Black has to respond, queen under attack. And now Magnus jumps in with his knight, and he's up a pawn against the world champ. Still 1.5, still looking great from the engine eval, but he's up against Gary Kasparov, the world champion, so it's not going to be easy. Gary's not just going to quit a pawn down. So the first move is this knight is under attack. The rook is under attack by the knight, so the rook has to move. Magnus claims the open d file, kicking this queen around. The queen repositions to the e file, putting some pressure on this bishop, making it a bit harder for this knight to move. It might be a little bit tough for Magnus here. His pieces are starting to get a bit potentially overextended, but the next move, which is somehow a blunder for Magnus, is rook f to e1. You can see the engine just drops immediately. Pretty much all his advantage is gone, and the reason is because Gary can just start to consolidate and bring his bishop out. There's this really interesting line which the computer wanted, and it's the only reason to or the only move to keep the advantage, is moving this bishop to c7. So it makes sense that pressure was getting a bit annoying here on the bishop, but the tactical reason it kind of works out is if Black then fianchettos their bishop, this knight jumps in all the way to the back rank of the Black pieces, and it's a fork on the queen and the bishop. So Magnus had to see those kind of ideas, which he missed, instead just playing rook to e1. And now with Gary bringing his bishop to the fianchettoed square, first, it's some pressure along the king side, but it also immediately threatens to capture this knight. So Magnus has to move. Gary gets a trade in the center, and then he swings his queen over, again threatening checkmate, showing just how strong this bishop is and where the compensation lies for Black. So Magnus decides he doesn't want to deal with the long-term attacking threats, decides to offer a queen trade, and Gary decides to oblige, and now you can see the engine is just 0.1, so even though Magnus is up a pawn, it is opposite colored bishops, which is notoriously difficult to win in these endgames. So I'll quickly run you through the endgame just to see what happens. Black just repositions their bishop, putting some pressure here. Magnus decides to push his pawn. They kick the bishop away. We get some trades, and you'll see now why it's just so difficult to win these opposite colored bishop endgames. So basically what Magnus wants to do is he wants to get this passed pawn because he has this majority over here. It's 3-on-3 over here, so there's not really going to be any play happening there. So Black just decides to bring his king forward. So does Magnus. Black put more pressure on this pawn, forcing Magnus to push it forward. And now we have this single A pawn, which would be the decider for Magnus, again, because of this 3-on-3 on the king side. But what Gary can do is just shove his bishop here in front of the pawn, and Magnus just really can't move that pawn at all. So that's why it's a draw. I mean, again, 3-on-3 here. This bishop is just blockading it. You can't really attack these bishops because they're opposite colors. And we'll see there's just a few more moves, a bit of shuffling, some trading going on between the two sides. Magnus defends his pawn with the bishop, but again, you can see it's not going anywhere. Again, more shuffling, more pawn pushing. Gary even decides to move his bishop. So it was sitting there, but Magnus can't really push it, otherwise the bishop will just take. So what Magnus does, he decides to move his bishop back, decides just to sacrifice the A pawn, and offered his opponent a draw, which Gary accepted. So I think this is a pretty impressive result for Magnus. 13 years old, he was an IM at the time as well. I can't imagine Gary was too happy with a draw, so congrats to Magnus.